The history of the German prisoners of war in Britain during and after the Second World War is, it's often overshadowed by the grander stories of wartime and victory and defeats. But for the communities where these camps were built and for the men who lived behind the wire, the experience left deep and lasting impressions. The German prisoners of war at Walderslade were not the first prisoners in Medway, as we've heard. And as you know from exhibits in the Guildhall, there's some fantastic exhibits there. We've got a long history, including the French prisoners of war. So that's one of the ships made by prisoners of war that they have at the Guildhall. So during that period, French and other enemy prisoners were confined in prison hulks, naval vessels moored at locations on Chatham Reaches, Gillingham and Sheerness, as well as inshore facilities. And by 1798, there were over 30,000 French prisoners of war. So I'll move on from that, though. So the ones I'm going to focus on now came to Camp 117 at Walderslade. They were held there during the Second World War between 1939 and 1948. Britain had hundreds of POW camps and internment camps. Over 500,000 German and Italian prisoners were held in this country, while others were sent to Allied countries such as Canada and Australia to minimise the risk of escape or sabotage in the event of invasion. They were primarily deployed as labourers, especially in agriculture, because of the labour shortages during the war. But following the fall of France in 1940, fears of a German invasion led to a surge in internments here, and thousands were deported from Canada and Australia. One of the outcomes of this was the tragic sinking of the SS Andorra Star, resulting in the deaths of over 800 internees. In total, 538 wartime camps have been identified across Britain, but the number is still, there were lots of them, and they're not all identified. But Camp 117 here at Walderslade stood on the field opposite Poacher's Pocket pub, which is there. And I've done, oh, no, I haven't, have I? There we go. So that's what it looks like now. And if you overlay the two, it is going to do it. There we go. You can sort of vaguely see how that maps on to where it is now. So it's sort of roughly where the library and the kebab shop are. So following the D-Day landings, a rapid Allied advance across Europe, German forces surrendered in large numbers, and we were soon responsible for housing a huge POW population. By 1946, over 400,000 German prisoners were being held in the UK, and that caused significant logistical pressures. Some estimates suggest that by late 1946, they made up as much as a quarter of the agricultural workforce, raising concerns within the labour movement that they were being used as slave labour to suppress British wages. So in Chatham, the Borough Council initially resisted accepting POWs. They had security concerns about having German and Italian prisoners here. The first 500 German prisoners arrived by train at Chatham Station and were marched under guard to the Hook Meadow camp. And local reactions were quite mixed. Some residents were obviously openly hostile, others more sympathetic. At Walderslade camp, there were reports of children gathering and throwing stones at the prisoners. One former gardener, Vincenz Fetzer, who was captured in France in 1944, he was held at Tunbridge, recorded in his diary, "The people are very angry and hostile towards us, which can only be attributed to propaganda. Children are for the most part friendly, if at first fearful. I can see straight away whether they're affected by the old people's views or whether they regard me as a human being." Fetzer was repatriated in early 1948, returning to his family's farm in Germany. But his grandson said that had it not been for that for that farm in Germany, he would have stayed in Britain because he'd come to like it here so much. So prisoners were involved in a number of rebuilding efforts after the war, new estates and working on damaged buildings. Housing developments in Street End Road, Wayfield and Weedswood. So here they are digging service trenches for water and drainage. And nationally, there was a resistance to the Christian virtue of loving one's enemy. In 1944, a local vicar appealed in his local parish paper for comforts to be given to German prisoners in hospital. And in response, a Reverend H.G. Green of Ipswich responded by sending a tin of rat poison, calling the prisoners blasphemers of God and butchers of men, expressing disdain for any appeal rooted in Christian compassion. He later said it was a joke and defended his stance by condemning German wartime atrocities. But the church authorities ended up having to issue statements to control the fallout, which all got a bit ugly. So life in the camp. Walderslade Camp 117 was surrounded by an 8-foot-high barbed wire fence with overhang and additional coils, and then a no-go perimeter around it. And at its peak, it housed around 1,000 prisoners, mostly Germans, some Russians and Poles. There were 18 barracks made of wood with 64 men in double bunks and a single stove. They also had a clinic, laundry, kitchen, mess hall and recreation area. And the guardhouse, as you saw on the previous map, was roughly where the Walderslade Library is now. It was largely a self-contained community with its own prisoners' council who organised social activities within the camp. It was tightly regulated and they wore distinctive clothing. You can see here the circles sewn on clothing, often a yellow diamond or a contrasting patch to mark out would-be escapees. And fraternising with locals was very much frowned on with severe punishment. That was actually, fraternisation laws were passed. Hansard records, under the Prisoners of War and Internees Access and Communication Order 1940, it is an offence to do in any place in the United Kingdom where prisoners of war are interned, persons or interned persons are detained, any act likely to prejudice the discipline of any prisoner of war or interned person. But as the hostilities subsided, prisoners began to live a more relaxed life, and some were even taken on trips, here seen at the seaside at Hastings, on an outing organised by Reverend G.K. Naderer, who was a half-German Anglican priest appointed by the Archbishop of Rochester to minister to the Hook Meadow camp. And as time went on, there was a slow thawing of restrictions. In May 1946, following permission from the Home Office, 100 POWs were allowed to attend church services at St Michael's in Chatham, after an invitation was extended by Father T. O'Riordan, who was in charge. While security was strict, a few prisoners did attempt escaping. A notable incident involved Hans Rauther, a 22-year-old Czech POW who escaped in March 1946 and remained free for 3 days before being recaptured at Gravesend. He'd been seen waiting for a bus to Gravesend, where he was said to have a girlfriend who sent him money, but he was also said to have a girlfriend in Maidstone. So I think they went to Maidstone first and didn't find him there. That's why he was away for so long. Others weren't quite so lucky, like the 2 prisoners who made a brief bid for freedom in May 46, but were caught within an hour at the Alexandra Hotel in Chatham on their way to the station. Another pair of German escapees were apprehended looking longingly out to sea at Sheerness Esplanade in August 46. They'd both previously lived in America and wanted to get back there. Germany was no good, they said. A former artilleryman from Sheerness, who'd recently come back from Germany, Mr. Bardo, heard them speaking German, and from their unshaven appearance and plimsolls, guessed they were prisoners of war. They'd already been interned for 3.5 years and were a bit fed up. He could speak German and said to the paper, they asked me if I was a soldier back from Germany, and when I replied yes and told them they'd better come along with me, they seemed quite content and replied, all right. And we walked along the seafront together and down to the bus station, where I handed them over to a police officer. But other people's idea of escape was a lot more permanent. In December 1947, just before Christmas, Walter Rosa, a 23-year-old prisoner, due to be repatriated to the Russian zone, hanged himself from a beam in the camp's cookhouse. No reason was given, but the psychological toll of captivity and dislocation, as well as the idea of returning to a home now occupied by the Russian army, may have had some influence on his actions. British and American forces were expected to follow the Geneva Convention, while the Russians made clear they would not treat former Nazi soldiers humanely. A combined services interrogation report revealed that many POWs feared being sent to Siberia or forced into hard labour in Russian-occupied zones. Disillusioned and war-weary, many showed signs of what we now recognise as PTSD, along with depression and survivor's guilt, and some may also may have begun to confront the last burden of their complicity, willing or not, in Nazi atrocities. However, back to the sunnier side. So, despite the attempts to have a forced social separation between prisoners and civilians, there was a thaw in relations as the war ended and people got closer together. In Christmas 1945, the men of Camp 117 made more than 1,400 toys for local children, repurposing and scavenging materials where possible. And some of these toys still exist. So this fort actually isn't from Camp 117. This was made on cliff by a German prisoner called Willy Drummer, who worked on a farm there, made it for the farmers' children, and that's in a private collection, but I have seen it, and as you see, I photographed it. And this little table, doll's house table, was part of an entire set of miniature furniture which was made and given to Walderslade Primary School on Darget's Road. When the head teacher retired in 1960, she took home some of the doll's house furniture that was going to be thrown away. And years later, the majority of the collection was returned to the school by her daughter, who served as a school governor. Subsequently, there was a fire at the school and everything was destroyed. So this one, which didn't go back, is the only little table that remains. In an interview I conducted earlier this year about the sort of friendly relations with prisoners, someone said, my wife's mum used to do a lot of field work too, you know. And when they worked, they had prisoners of war with them. There were 7 of them. One of them used to carry Phyllis about on his shoulders because he had a daughter of the same age. They was no different to us, mate. Them prisoners, they was lovely people. Some of them, it wasn't their bloody fault, was it? No, it wasn't. And another one of the quite impressive things that was made by prisoners is this painting, A Still Life, which is again in a private collection. During the infamous winter of 1947, which was the coldest winter the country had seen for 4 years, and snow blocked the roads, dozens of POWs were assigned to snowplows, clearing heavy drifts, blocking roads in Strood rural district. And one talented prisoner, Gunter Trepte, carved a roadside shrine depicting Christ on the cross in the banked-up snow beside the stretch of Walderslade Road known as Waterworks Hill. And that made the national press. That was in the Evening Standard. Now, I'm very grateful. I don't think Alan's here. I think he was going to come. But Alan Blatchley shared some information with me about a particular German prisoner of war who made the toy castle. And this is Willy Drummer, German infantryman, born in 1911 near Hamburg. And he wrote recollections of his time on various farms in Kent that offer some personal insight into the life of a prisoner. He was born into a farming family that had fallen on hard times. His father had sold the family farm in order to emigrate to Brazil in the 1920s, and then the hyperinflation of Weimar Germany came along and consumed the family's money. So they fell into poverty, and he took on a legal apprenticeship at a local magistrate's to feed the family. In 1942, married with 5 children, he was conscripted into the Reserves Battalion 181 in Siegen, Westphalia, and became an infantryman and was sent to the Eastern Front. He survived this posting mainly because he worked in the office, and a general who came from the same neck of the woods as him posted him back at the command centre at the rear. They later moved west to the south of France, and he was hospitalised with jaundice and was later captured by American forces and taken back to America, first where he worked in a jam factory in Wisconsin. And there, he said, after 4 weeks, the prisoners proved they were industrious and willing to work, and the locals became friendlier. He developed meaningful friendships with American families, noting they were affectionate and I will never forget them. But then, 1946, they were shipped back. They stopped on the way at Antwerp, where, unsurprisingly, they had a very cold reception, and then brought to Rochester. They were disembarked, and Willy Drummer was taken to a camp at Westmoreland, where they were in 30-man barracks. And they were divided alphabetically, not by the brigades they'd come in, so they were all mixed up and had to find new ways of getting on with each other. And he said the priority was to find people keen on eating and smoking, because they were likely to work harder in order to get food and cigarettes. They'd all experienced much worse conditions as soldiers, and the English camp manager, an old staff sergeant, was loved by the POWs because he was humane and fair. He recognised the need to work hard to gain the trust of the English, saying the English public were also friendly and good to us. They understood that none of us had ever held anything personally against an Englishman, and we were only doing our service. In fact, we were quite happy to be in England. We knew from letters and newspapers it was much worse in our homeland. So Drummer worked on several farms, including Leybourne Farm in Westmoreland. This is Drummer here at Westmoreland. That's slightly out of focus image of the camp. And he ended up leading a commando of POWs working on farms at Leybourne and Courtsole Farm in Cliff. He said, even though I was not the strongest man, my comrades knew I'd lead them well and put in a good word for them with the farmers. He noted many Kent farmers appreciated POW's strong work ethic and fair attitude, rewarding them with better food and personal respect. And he developed a real attachment to the Filmer family, who farmed Courtsole Farm, having a particular respect for Mr. Filmer and how fairly he treated all the farm workers, many of whom had been there since his father had farmed those fields. He said, the friendliness of all the families was unforgettably nice. At the Filmers, I slept in a proper bed for the first time in 4 years, inconceivable at the time. They understood that none of us had ever, never had held anything personally against an Englishman. And he recalled how in general, the English people didn't treat them badly at all. The Filmers actually travelled to Germany in 1969 after he'd been repatriated to visit him and his family. And 21 years after his release, he returned to Kent with his wife and visited the farms where he'd worked as a prisoner, stayed with the Filmers and helped with the haymaking at Court Farm. He had a very positive view. He said many of the people in the world, many of the people in the world have the good volition to be friends, so that no more blood is spilt through senseless war. Clifford, who and my kind friends there will forever be locked in my heart, and happy memories of it will be with me, I can't read, sorry, for the whole of my life. Now, fraternisation, as we said, was illegal, but it went on quite a lot. Some of the interactions between locals and prisoners of war were inevitable and sometimes affectionate. In 1946, Emily Polhill, a local woman, was summoned for conveying without lawful authority a piece of cake to a prisoner of war after throwing a slice of cake over the fence at Walderslade. She was found guilty and fined £1, and the POW who received it had 28 days hard labour. Don't know if he actually got to eat it. In April 46, a canteen worker was fined £2 and a guinea costs for taking cigarettes in for the prisoners, and reports surfaced of local girls fraternising with men held in the camp, prompting the camp commandant, Lieutenant Colonel F. Goldsmith, to erect a corrugated iron screen along the camp fence to prevent such encounters. Under the headline, POW camp has screen to beat fratting girls, fratting being the short for fraternising, it said Goldsmith had 12 German prisoner of war camps under his command in Kent, but Walderslade was the worst of the lot, going on to say, I have had to do this to protect my prisoners from the girls. I've tried in various ways to stop these village flappers from fraternising with the prisoners. The village police officer has also worked hard to stop it, but the parents of some of the girls won't cooperate. One of the prisoners had been transferred to Westmoreland prison camp, 10 miles away, and his Walderslade girlfriend cycled there to see him, adding that the men are quite happy if the local girls will only leave them alone. The report went on to say there are 1,000 prisoners in the camp and villagers speak highly of their general behaviour. The fence clearly had limited effect because in July 46, 2 girls admitted at Chatham Juvenile Court that they'd spent the night with 2 escaped prisoners. A photo of one of the girls was found in the prisoner's possession. Asked by the chairman of the court, Mr. Mitchell, why they went with the Germans, one of the girls replied, "We did it because we liked them." Mitchell responded, "Are you not disgusted with yourselves?" "No," replied the girls. But it wasn't just one-way traffic. In 1948, there were reports from the divorce court of an undefended divorce petition from a woman on Richard Street, Rochester, for a degree nisi against her husband on the ground of adultery. He'd met a German girl while abroad and wanted to marry her instead. Onto football. It was a significant form of popular entertainment during the war years. Despite the suspension of official competitions such as the Football League and FA Cup, a football team was formed by the German prisoners of war at Walderslade and played friendly matches against local sides, attracting considerable public interest. One notable match saw the team beat Rainham 11-2, with a suggestion that they had an international player on their team, which might have had an impact on the score. And some of you might remember Bert Trautmann, who played for Manchester City and St Helens, who was a Nazi paratrooper and turned into an English football hero. Some changes were made to the rules, including the prohibition of the shoulder charge in an effort to reduce the risk of things getting out of hand between the two sides. And gate receipts from the Rainham fixture were donated to St Bartholomew's Hospital. At Christmas, once the fraternising rules had been relaxed, Willy Drummer, for one, was welcomed by several families. He actually had 3 families that he had to pick and choose at what time he went to because he didn't want to let anyone down. In 1948, once again, there was a generous response by the people of the towns to the scheme which was inaugurated a year ago for allowing German prisoners to spend their Christmas in English homes. And people did sort of, line up to have a German prisoner for Christmas. There's a wonderful description from Liverpool of Heinz Elfner, who describes his Christmas. With a fellow prisoner, I was taken to an elderly couple at Bootle. The lieutenant went up to the door, rang the bell, and informed the person opening the door, "Here are the 2 Germans you asked for." We tried to make ourselves presentable in our prisoner's garb, but I felt very nervous. I'd not set foot in a private house for years and was anxious to behave in a proper manner. I needn't have worried. The welcome was very friendly. There were no formalities, and we called each other by our Christian names and managed to communicate quite well. The interpreting was left to me, as I'd learnt English at school. I can hardly describe my feelings when we were invited to sit at the table for a Christmas meal. There was still food rationing, but it was evident that these people had made a special effort. True to British custom, the master of the house was carving the turkey and saw to it that their guests received an extra large portion. I was close to tears when I started to eat. This act of human kindness, showed to me by these few people, represented the general feeling of the majority of the entire nation at the time. I shall never forget it. But tensions did remain. There was an incident where 3 young ex-servicemen who had been recently demobilised and on a drunken night out, coming back past the Walderslade camp, were asked by the prisoner of war on guard to keep the noise down, and they assaulted him and were imprisoned for a short time for the assault. Now, the Walderslade site was then, in 1948, plans were being approved by the Chatham Council that Walderslade would be developed as a satellite town with a provision made for a primary school, 550 houses, community centre, welfare centre, churches, a public house, a Salvation Army hall, 12 shops, garages, a filling station and playing fields, and the land earmarked for the scheme included Camp 117. But because it already had these blocks on it, the council sought to get approval from the government to use them as temporary housing. So when the last German prisoners of war left Walderslade camp on the 16th of June 1948, the site was swiftly repurposed to address local housing needs. They were called home-hungry families, and 30 of them from Chatham were installed at the Walderslade camp. Each hut was transformed into a self-contained unit with washing and sanitary facilities, a communal hall and a warden to support the residents. And another hut was given to the Kent Education Committee for school use, and the football pitch was turned over to Walderslade Football Club. Now, a watchman had to be employed to prevent the very real possibility of unauthorised squatting. Squatting had become a very live issue as servicemen returned to a wrecked country and found their families without adequate accommodation. As landlords withheld property in favour of wealthier tenants and local councils weren't constructing housing quickly enough, by August 46, most authorities had yet to complete a single home, and waiting lists were up to 12 years. Councillor Semple of the Housing Committee said, "Any persons who consider squatting will be severely dealt with. We do not regard them as squatters but as queue jumpers who want to get ahead by unfair means." And by 1948, squatters were already a problem at the recently vacated Fort Luton camp, which was squatted by desperate families. They were living in army huts on the Maidstone Road in Gillingham, and were described by councillors as living in appalling conditions in unheated rooms with no facilities for washing, no coppers, electric light or gas, and there was real fear of the outbreak of disease. Now, the economic effects of these prisoners being used in agriculture was significant. With much of the male workforce enlisted and the nation's dependence on domestic food production growing, the British countryside relied heavily on Axis POWs. By the late 40s, Britain was producing around 70% of its own food, in part due to this labour force, helping reduce reliance on the overseas supply routes. From 44 to 47, they made up 13% of the rural workforce, and despite being officially considered less efficient than British workers, it's estimated in reports that 47% of the productivity of regular male workers, they still accounted for about 10% of the net agricultural output. And in terms of value, this was £53 million a year, peaking at £85 million a year in 1947. German prisoners were regarded by many in agriculture as indispensable, no doubt because of broader structural issues, with only half of the 85,000 demobilised British farm workers wanting to go back into farming after they'd been demobbed. At the height of the 46 potato harvest, of the 890,000 workers, 180,000 were German POWs. On the other side of the coin, farmers expressed frustration at having to pay adult wage rates for young, inexperienced prisoners of war, rates that exceeded those paid to similarly aged farm workers from Britain. And German POWs were generally preferred over Italians, who were sometimes criticised for their poor productivity. Although one farmer said 2 Italians were worth 10 casual workers, but Lord Somerleyton from his estate in Suffolk said that 2 boys could outperform 30 Italians. That's hard to tell if that was just jingoism, though. So despite these mixed perceptions, the economic and logistical role of POWs in sustaining British agriculture was undeniable. While historians today often acknowledge the essential part these men played, official government records of the time were more guarded. The caution may reflect sensitivities around the optics of relying on enemy labour during the war and its immediate aftermath. Nonetheless, by the time they were repatriated, their absence left a notable labour vacuum, which wasn't easily filled. So, by the end of the war, 25,000 German prisoners chose to stay in Britain, and one of the reasons was the passage of time. They were young men when they came here, they'd lived here for several years, often working closely with civilians in agriculture, especially. And in many cases, they'd formed friendships, some had even fallen in love and married. So by the time repatriation became a reality in 47-48, some prisoners had established their life here and didn't want to uproot it again. The situation in post-war Germany was grim. Much of the country was in ruins, the cities flattened, infrastructure broken, and political uncertainty was still widespread. In contrast with Britain, they had shelter, food, work, and social acceptance, which made it much less appealing to return. And the labour shortage meant that they had work. The government introduced schemes allowing German POWs to stay voluntarily as civilian workers. For others, the choice to remain was shaped by changing views. Years of living outside Nazi Germany, engaging with ordinary British people and working in relative peace gave them a different perspective on the world they'd left behind. It was a fresh start. In the words of Willy Drummer, as we saw with the words of Willy Drummer, former POWs returned to Germany with mixed memories. Some, interviewed by Naderer, Reverend G.K. Naderer, became apostles of peace and goodwill, sharing positive accounts of their treatment in Britain. And Drummer's experience in the agricultural workforce was not unique. Reverend Naderer later witnessed the severe post-war poverty in Germany, where a loaf of bread could cost a week's wages, and noted the contrast with the relatively humane conditions at camps like Walderslade. In the Chatham News of Friday the 17th of 1948, an editorial piece spoke about the visit of a 27-year-old German called Gunter, who returned to stay with Mr. and Mrs. N.E. Morton in Boundary Road, Chatham, after he'd stayed a decade earlier on a school exchange visit. And in 1960, another prisoner of war, Gunter Leister, returned to a family who'd hosted him one Christmas. His appearance in the town drew a response from another former comrade who'd stayed in Chatham and made his life here, asking to meet up. So it's a really complex mixture of people desperate wanting to go home and them staying here. And I think as we reflect on these events 80 years later, it's impossible to ignore the echoes in our present, with people still confined behind fences and detained in camps on the margins of society and alienated from full social inclusion. The story of Camp 117 and other prisoner of war camps remind us that history is not only shaped by the governments and armies, but also by the countlessly small acts of human kindness that happen in the most unlikely of places. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for bringing a very human story back to life. I was reminded that growing up in Oxford, our neighbour had been an ex-German prisoner of war, and even in the 70s no one was allowed to mention that fact. And my mum was part German, she was Swiss German, and we lived up on the Wayfield Road for 6 months. And the reason we moved was my mum was caught in the phone box talking in German to my godmother, and they threatened to tie her in the phone box and petrol bomb her. So it just goes to prove that very stories still exist to man as you walk forward. Is there any questions for Chris? So I was going to have something.
Well, any plans to have anything up to commemorate it on site?
I hadn't thought of it, but that's not a bad idea, is it? That's a very good idea, yes. That's a project.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Hello.
How many Germans did settle in Medway? Do we know afterwards?
No, because it was...
Well, prisoners of war, let's say.
Well, it would have been mostly prisoners of war, I think, who did settle afterwards. No, I don't have an exact figure for that. That is a good one to because they...
your talk,
Yeah.
I was always understood it was mainly Italian prisoners.
Yes. Well, there were different camps. So 117 was the one I focused on. There was another camp there with Italians. And Italians, it was interesting with the Italians because, of course, they stopped being co-belligerents, as they were called, halfway through. But they had been when they were captured. So they were in this sort of strange limbo. So they had a lot more freedom to move around than the Germans did, even during the war. And apparently at Shoulder of Button Wood, there are still on the trees some markings where they've carved, I think, service numbers and names. And I've searched and searched, but not found them. But someone has told me that you can find them up there still.
I'm sorry, just one more question.
Yeah.
You mentioned St Michael's. So were they allowed, at the end of the war, to go to church? Or did somebody visit the camp? G.K. Naderer had services for them. He was the chaplain at the camp. But it was, yes, they were allowed. They were taken under escort to places like St Michael's and other... At St Michael's, when I was a child,
Oh, right. Oh, amazing. Right, yeah. Yeah, no, they were taken under escort there, and there were different denominations, because there were Lutherans and, obviously that was just, regular Anglican, but they did have specific Lutheran pastors working for them as well. So, yeah.
Just
Hello.
a small question. Who gathered these prisoners right through to 1948? Was it still the military or?
Yes, military,
It was all
yeah.
military,
Yeah. And interesting as well, they worked after, so after the war had ended, and they were in this sort of limbo between still being prisoners and not being repatriated. Some of them, again, stayed on and worked in bomb disposal with the Royal Engineers. There was a group of them who, I think it was about 12 or 13, who actually were working with the Royal Engineers and, actually became, part of their unit. So, yeah, it was a bit of real strange mixture of, because the other thing is these weren't category C prisoners, so they'd already been triaged and denazified. So the category C prisoners were the hardcore Nazis, and they were the ones, they were sent to Wormwood Scrubs. These were largely, I'm sure there was variation within them, but these were largely Westphalian farm boys who'd been called up and just weren't that interested in anything that's been going on. He had served on the Eastern Front, and partisan hunting in the Eastern Front was a bit of a nasty business. But I think generally these were fairly apolitical, and so the more dangerous ones were interned and kept separate.
Right, can we just give Chris a massive round of
Thank you.